Welcome back to Air Quality Matters. We already have the tools and knowledge we need to make a difference to the quality of the air we breathe in our built environment. The conversations we have and how we share what we know is the key to our success. I'm Simon Jones, and coming up, a conversation with Esther Sternberg, a professor of medicine, author, scientist, and thought leader, and I do not use that word lightly. Esther is internationally recognised for her discoveries in the science of the mind-body interaction in illness and healing, and the role of place in well-being. She is a pioneer and major force in collaborative initiatives on mind, body, stress, wellness, and environment interrelationships. Her work has influenced many of the approaches we have today around healthy buildings. Her books on healing spaces, the balance within, and well at work have been a framework for better spaces and health for so many of the people we talk to on this podcast. Principal and founder of Star Mountain LLC, Esther Sternberg is now dedicated to embedding the principles of integrative health into built and natural environments. And up until just this year, was research director at the Andrew Weil Centre for Integrative Medicine. She speaks from a place of healing and frames the built environment in often fascinating perspectives, and sometimes uncomfortable ones, pushing against dogma and tradition, not afraid to push the boundaries, offer different perspectives and buck entrenched viewpoints. So strap in. We start with spirituality. This is a good one, and I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. Don't forget to check out the sponsors in the show notes and at airqualitymatters.net. This is a conversation with Esther Sternberg. One of the quotes I thought was fascinating from your book, and it was right at the beginning actually. You say, but there's an important step between designing spaces to do no harm and designing spaces to support well-being. And I think that's the really interesting distinction here. Do you know what I mean? That we think about buildings in terms of limiting our exposure to harm, but that's really principally not what buildings are for, is it?
Well, it's a fascinating distinction, but it should actually be a continuum. So you have to start with doing no harm. You must have excellent filtration, excellent ventilation, frequent fresh air turnover. That's a given. I mean, and interestingly, I'd say about every 30 years or so, the building science and medical community recognize that we need to have clean air. And we are actually now, especially at a moment where it is globally accepted. The United Nations kickoff for the global initiative on healthy air shows that countries and organizations around the world recognize this. And this is because of COVID. With COVID, everybody in the entire world became a building science expert and knew what MERV 13 filters were. Who knew that before COVID? And, we know that we need frequent fresh air turnover. Why is that? Because the virus was spread through the ventilation system. And in order to reduce your susceptibility to the virus, you need to reduce the dose to which you're exposed, so how much of the virus, the duration of exposure, and that comes through healthy, clean air and frequent fresh air turnover and excellent ventilation and filtration. However, the third leg of the stool is your own resilience. Whether you get sick and how sick you get from anything, a virus, a bacteria, mold, allergy, whatever it is, depends on the dose to which you're exposed, the duration of exposure, and your own resilience. And it's the resilience piece which has been ignored or left out, designing for well-being. I think it's because it sounds a little new age, shishi foo-foo, well-being, what's well-being? In fact, I was once at a U.S. Green Building Council conference and I used the word well-being, and a woman stood up and said, "You can't use that word. That's too new age." And I said, "No, it's not new age. Well-being is really an essential part of health." So the biomedical model of health is do no harm, get rid of disease, right? Think about the National Institutes of Health in the United States. Each institute is named for a disease, right? Cardiovascular disease, neurological diseases and stroke, infectious diseases. And that's typically for hundreds of years, the biomedical model of health, get rid of disease. But we've gone way beyond that now. We can actually prevent disease through enhancing resilience and your own ability to fight disease together with all of the, space age treatments that have been developed. And that's called integrative medicine. It's a form of preventive medicine.
Yeah, and I've had this conversation, and I've spoken to you about this before with the medical community. They fixing stuff that's gone wrong is a safe space for medicine, isn't it? Because people come in deficit, and your job is to reduce that deficit. At a very simple level, you come in with a broken leg and you go away with a not broken leg anymore. That's the measurement of success. It's a safe space. People understand that and are comfortable in that. But as you say, when you get into this world of well-being, it becomes an uncomfortable space for many, to be quite frank. And it was the bit, I'll be honest with you, it was the bit when I was reading that at a high level your book that the word jumped out at me: spirituality. You're looking at a book about the built environment, and I read a heading of a chapter of the book on spirituality, and talking about shishi and fufu and getting a bit nervous and a bit twitchy in my seat. I was going, oh my God, wonder what that section's going to be about. So we'll dive into that. But it's interesting, isn't it? We focus on energy efficiency and ergonomics and sustainability, but a central pillar for buildings is well-being. They have to work for people. And you were talking about this element, I was noting down here, resilience.
Yes.
Well-being isn't just about feeling nice in a space. We all know that we perform better, we're more resilient. We should come onto the spirituality bit because it's important. It's about focus and flow and creating nurturing spaces. Yes. I think people, if they stop for a second, can probably get that at some level makes some sense, that a space has to work for us, doesn't it?
Well, I want to go back to your saying medicine is biomedical model and medicine is about fixing things. So is building science. Facilities managers, they're always fixing things, right? There's a leak, the HVAC isn't working, and that's essential. And that's easy to grasp. It's easy. It's concrete, right?
And it's reactive. You don't have to plan too much. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I think that well-being, the word well-being maybe has a bad rap because it has been in the bucket of that new age kind of thing. But as you said, resilience. Now, resilience is think about resilience like you think about a rubber band. If a rubber band is new and you stretch it, it bounces back right away. If it's played and old, you stretch it and it doesn't bounce back. And that's how our bodies are. You need to be able to respond to any invader, any stressor, whether it's bacteria, whether it's an emotional stress, and then quickly get back to baseline. And that's what really resilience is, and that's what health is, and that's what well-being is. And without being able, the goal is not to get rid of stress, so don't even try, right? Forget it. There's lots of stresses. There's huge numbers of stresses in the world now. And you can't get rid of it. You need your stress response to be able to react, to fight or flee, to help you heal. You need that stress response, but it needs to go back to baseline. And that's where the environment that you live in or work in or play. My book is called Well at Work, Creating Wellbeing in Any Workspace. One of the readers told me you should have called it Well at Life, because it talks about how you can create your well-being spaces. Really, it can be applied to wherever you work, wherever you learn, wherever you live, wherever you play. It's all the same principles. And the principles are based on the 7 domains of integrative health, which the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine has defined as the now, integrative medicine is a way of enhancing your resilience, enhancing your well-being through prevention. And what are the 7 domains? Sleep, resilience, so the stress and relaxation response, environment, which includes clean air and, no off-gassing and no toxins and whatever, but it also includes the green environment, movement, relationships, sleep, I said sleep already, spirituality and nutrition. So that's where, you talked about this, there's 7 chapters in the middle of the book where I talk about each of these domains and how you can embed them into the built environment. And spirituality is one of them. And I have to tell you, that was the hardest chapter to write, because how do you bring spirituality into the workplace? And I don't mean religiosity. So what are the elements of spirituality? There's a temporal domain and there's a physical domain. So the temporal domain is going offline for a few moments during the day, having a chance to meditate, but you don't have to say Om or sit with your legs crossed. It's just being in the moment. And that helps to kick in your relaxation response and reduce your stress response. The physical domain is, in order to be able to engage in these activities that help you balance your stress and relaxation response, you need the spaces to do it. If you're working in a large barn with many, many desks and lots of noise and no place to go and no access to the outdoors or nature or any of these experiences that can help reduce your stress, then you cannot achieve that state of balance. So you need to be in a space where you can go to different places and spaces that are designed to support well-being and going offline for a moment and so on.
The interesting thing is that when we think about the places where we do our best work, I think instinctively we know the feeling that those spaces give us. And I think you frame that quite well in the spirituality section. It's those places where you find yourself just doing your best work. There's this flow, there's this focus that you get in the right space that comes from somewhere. But equally this sense that you belong there as well. There's a sense of belonging, that this is the right place for you. That's why you're doing your best work. So I can imagine it was actually a really hard section to articulate from a buildings perspective. Does that spirituality with the health dynamic translate very well? So how is spirituality translated in the health dynamic, and is there a bit of a gap between that and how you try to describe it for builders?
Well, that's an interesting question. So I want to go back to, we talked about flow.
Yeah.
So I think we need to define flow. So flow is defined as effortless, or a sense of effortless performance. But in fact, with brain imaging, researchers have found that flow is actually effortful, and that the parts of the brain that control the stress response are actually turned on. And that part of the brain, one of those parts, is very important in focus. So focused attention, when you're stressed, the part of the brain that's rich in adrenaline, and adrenaline-like molecules turns on, and it's firing. The nerve cells are firing a lot. And that is what gives you focused attention, the ability to fight or flee. That's your stress response. So why don't you feel stressed when you're in flow if your stress response is turned on. But instead you feel relaxed, you actually feel rewarded, you feel positive. It's because, interestingly, at the same time as your stress response is turned on, the default networks of the brain that give you awareness of what's going on inside your body. Okay, your heart beating fast, your stomach gurgling, you want to run to the bathroom, all those things happen when you're stressed. But those default modes are turned off when you're in flow. So it's really an interesting thing to get into that state. It's kind of like meditation, but it's different from meditation. But meditation can help get you there. So the other thing that's turned on when you're in a state of flow is your reward pathways, the dopamine reward, positive, good feeling networks in the brain are turned on. So that's in a state of flow, you have these opposite parts of the brain turned on. So you actually feel effortless, even though it's quite effortful. Now, how do you get there? So there's two things I want to talk about the stress response and flow. Let's say the flow response. Think about a rainbow. If there's a rainbow over us here, and to your far right, your stress response is turned down very low. You're lying down, you're reading, you're half asleep, you think you're at the beach. You would not be asking me questions and you would not be performing, nor would I, okay? In order to perform at peak, you have to get your stress response up to that middle of the rainbow above your head. If your stress response becomes so strong that you fail, you fall over the edge to the other side of the rainbow, that's when you freeze, that's when your performance fails, that's when you make mistakes. So the goal is not to get rid of stress, as I said before. The goal is to find your middle of the rainbow for whatever task is at hand. If you are at the beach, yeah, sure, you want to be relaxing and lying down and your stress response is low. If you're performing at peak at work and you find that you are logy or tired and you're not being able to put two words together, that's when you need to get your energy up. And you can do that in a number of ways. You could exercise, you can take a walk, you can go outside, breathe fresh air. That's really important because carbon dioxide makes you sleepy and makes you have errors. And the more you breathe carbon dioxide out in a small space, the more impaired your cognition will be. So there are a number of things you can do to get yourself at peak of the stress response. I like to say that before any event, usually there's some IT or AV issue that goes, and that, of course, turns my stress response on. But you don't want it turned on too much. Now, if you fall over the edge of that rainbow when you're too stressed, then you need to do the opposite. That's when meditating, taking a moment offline, even for a few moments, breathing deeply, walking outside in nature, all of these things are in the bucket of well-being and of integrative health and of spirituality, but they are activities that can help you move from that extreme stress to that middle of the rainbow. Flow is the same. If you are there's a relationship between boredom and performance with flow. It has to do with your skill, your level of skill at whatever the task is. If your skill set is way beyond what the task is that you're doing, you'll be bored. So you'll start feeling logy. You'll start, your mind will wander. If your skill set is not up to scratch for the task that you're doing, then you're going to feel stressed. So in order to get into flow in the middle of your flow rainbow, you have to engage in these various different activities that help you move from boredom and extreme stress. And again, it's those activities that are usually considered spiritual, like meditation, like focus, like repetitive actions, rituals. Rituals have been actually shown made up rituals. It doesn't have to be a religious ritual, although rituals are common across all religions. But made up rituals have been shown to help students taking a math test. If they engage in some ritual, they perform better. They get into that state of flow. And that's another aspect, if you will, of spirituality that can be applied to the work domain. So think about elite athletes. There's a story of a baseball player who used to, with his bat, write the Hebrew letter "Hi" in the dust, in the dirt, and that helped him get into that state of flow. And sports figures always have their own rituals for getting into that state. You watch the Olympics, the skaters, before they go on, they're sitting there meditating, so there are techniques to help you perform at peak and get into flow.
Yeah, flow's really interesting. And I think the sport parallel is really interesting as well. There was a couple of words I was writing down as you were talking there. One was engineered ? When we're talking about spaces, are these the kind of environments that we can engineer to create the best possible chance of reaching these states of good performance?
Yes. So again, if I said you're sitting in a barn with many, many desks and it's noisy and you now have no place to go, you can't get into that state. You need to have lots of choices. So the mid-century Robert Propst designed what he called the action office, where people could go to different stations to do different kinds of work. Unfortunately, that morphed towards the end of the 20th century into the dreaded cubicle farms, and getting more people squished into a space and for profit, really. But fortunately, we've gone back to giving people at work options of many different kinds of spaces to go to, depending upon what the work is, how they're feeling, their personality. We found in our work with the U.S. General Services Administration, where we used wearable devices to measure the impacts, wearable health devices to measure the impacts of up to 11 different environmental attributes, measured continuously and in real time. And we also looked at office layout, and we found that people in open office design, which really is active office design, moved more during the day, were less stressed when they went home at night, had better sleep quality, fell asleep faster, woke up the next morning in a better mood, and were less fatigued the next day. And that's because they had choices of places to go to and to move more. And moving is really an important way of getting, if you're feeling logy, as I mentioned at that end of the rainbow, getting up and moving is really important. But if you don't have a space to move to, you're not going to have that ability to create your own environment. We also found that people who were more introverted preferred a quieter, more lonely space, and people who were more extroverted preferred a more of a sort of background noise going on and more activity around them. I think those are the people who are sitting and working in the coffee shops all day. But it's not that an employer should say, okay, I'm going to give you a personality test and figure out where you should sit. That is absolutely not what should be done. You just have to provide more different kinds of spaces so people can choose for themselves, depending on how they feel at the moment, the kind of work they're doing, and their personality, and where they work best.
I think that's really interesting. I was only just having this conversation with Chandra Sakar, who is involved with a lot of work over in Singapore in hot and humid climates. And we were talking about a very similar idea, that one of the things that they found through their work, particularly in hot and humid climates, was actually very stable air conditioned offices gave a much higher level of dissatisfaction to employees than environments that had a spectrum of environments where people had to have agency in controlling those spaces.
Yes.
Some spaces you had to turn a fan on, other spaces you had to shut a blind, other spaces were much warmer than others. You created a bit of discomfort and agency and mobility in these environments and allowed people, because as we know with indoor environmental quality, it's an incredible colourful spectrum of responses on the human body, from light and sound to acoustics to air quality. One size will never fit all, you know,
Exactly.
and we have to create these environments where people can find that optimum space for how they are on the day, because you're going to be different from one day. Even the same person is going to be different from one day to the next, one morning to the afternoon, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, yeah, and I think that's why people preferred to work from home, in COVID, because you have that agency. And office towers were designed mid-century through really COVID to have one size fits all, and one size fits no one.
Yeah. The other words I was writing down when you were talking, it's probably going to take us off on a little bit of a tangent. My apologies. When we were talking about focus and flow, as I was thinking about this athlete analogy, and one of the things that athletes try to do is to get into a position where they can flow, where they can perform at their best, is they have to understand capacity. They have to go beyond those points to put themselves into positions of stress so that the normative backstop, if you like, of good performance is comfortable to reach or is reachable, that you're not pushing yourself beyond the limit to get to a point where you can perform. And I'm interested, I wonder how that translates into our work lives, where we have to curate spaces where people, if you want to really perform, because you were talking about, you know, being proficient at a task, you're not going to find flow if you're stretching too far to do a particular task. Well, if you're going to grow as a human being, you need to put yourselves into positions where you're constantly uncomfortable and pushing yourself, right? So that when you do take a step back and you find that flow space, you've now moved on a bit. You're finding flow in and performing better and better each time. It's a really interesting idea, that the mental picture that creates. If you were trying to engineer spaces and trying to engineer performance in the built environment, creating these environments like athletes do, that not only provide a space for you to be there, but also provide spaces for you to push yourself in and grow. And
It's yeah, it's a very interesting concept. I'm thinking of one aspect that I describe in the book, that is using virtual reality, or really immersive. It's not using virtual reality with the Oculus, with the goggles. It's being in a room of virtual nature spaces. And I tell the story in the book of Morel Phillips, who was a young woman working in the video game industry, and she was in a severe accident, had neurotrauma, was in and out of hospital, and was desperate to be in nature, but couldn't be in nature. So we can talk about nature in another few minutes, but being in nature is one way that your stress response reduces. You can, reset yourself to then perform at peak. But she couldn't be in nature. So she had an aha moment, and she shared with me that it was when she was in hospital and she read my previous book, Healing Spaces, The Science of Place and Wellbeing. And that inspired her to change her career. And instead of working in the video game industry, she used her skill set to set up a studio in New York City called Studio Elsewhere. And she set it up in 2019. And it was a space where you walk into a room which is dimly lit, and it has some, plants around. And then you call out, you see on the wall, you sit in a comfortable chair and you look in front of you, and there are several choices. You can call out elsewhere, take me to a quiet mountain lake, or take me to the beach, or a redwood forest. And all of a sudden the whole wall lights up, and you feel like you're at a quiet mountain lake. She, has video. She does recordings of nature sounds, and you hear the water lapping and the birds chirping and so on. And that was in 2019. She set it up originally to work with athletes, actually, speaking of, finding that space. And then 2020 happened, and she realized she was at ground zero for COVID, burnout, suicidality, depression, anxiety in healthcare workers. So she quickly ramped up with Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City, and now has over 70 recharge rooms across the country. We actually have one at the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine. It's the only one, to my knowledge, in an office space. There's also one in high school that we set up here in Tucson. And what she's finding, and we're finding together, is that there is a dose effect of being in this space of 15 minutes a day. You need to be there a minimum of 15 minutes a day. You can be there for as long as you want, but 15 minutes a day reduces stress, reduces depression, reduces anxiety, improves sleep quality. And we're actually finding that it reduces the stress hormone cortisol. So having access to that kind of space can help you get your mind into a mindset that then can allow you to go back into the workspace and do your work. It kind of resets your brain to be able to then go to the next level.
Yeah, it's really, I just keep having these mental pictures. My daughter used to do athletics, track running, and there was all these, to improve performance, there was all these things that were going on, from, rest days to resets to fartlek training, where you pace yourself at different speeds and push the body, and then find the middle point and go below it and then above it, and this constant way of finding ways to improve performance, and rest being so critical. And you can really see that translating to the workplace, that you create these cycles and environments that encourage optimal performance, basically.
Right. However, how often is it not translated into the workplace, where, you're working 24/7? It's really important that you be there 12 hours a day. And, if you're there 12 hours a day, 14 hours a day, you're going to get burnt out. You're not going to be performing at peak. And so I think that it hasn't translated into the workplace. It's beginning to, I think, certainly in healthcare. When I was coming up through the system, and, I was on call and up for 48 hours in the surgical department. And, by the end of it, I was totally exhausted. And of course I was not performing at peak, but that was the culture. And in fact, one was disparaged if you didn't, do that kind of macho thing. But now, fortunately, there's a lot of attention in the healthcare sector to, pacing yourself, and because it can have life and death consequences.
Yeah. The other interesting thing that I noted was around sustainability, and that ability, when you're putting yourself into this quite a precise mode of flow and focus, where there's an element of stress, that you're concentrating, your body is focused and mind is focused on something, and you create an environment to encourage that. And I would imagine it's in some ways quite a stimulating environment, that you've got blue light, you've got, fresh air, it's not too warm, you're stimulated in the right way to be focusing on tasks.
Yes.
But from what I understand of the chemistry of the body, that there's a time frame to stimulation with body chemistry. If you're introducing adrenaline into the body, the body will become resilient to it over time. It will wear out. It's not a sustainable state to put yourself in, right? And I know you've got these other elements that are kind of reducing some of the anxiety potentially elements that come with stress response of, like you say, the knotted stomach, the feeling, the palpitations, the feeling that this isn't good for you, that you want a flight. So you've got the right amount of adrenaline and the right amount of focus to be doing good work without hopefully too much of the negatives. But that's not something that happens for 12 hours a day or 8 hours a day.
No,
You have to cut.
no.
It's something you build up to, you do good work, and then you take a break from,
Yeah.
you de-stress.
I mean, that's what burnout is.
Yeah.
If you're constantly pushing and pushing and pushing your body and you're pumping out all those stress hormones, you're eventually going to get burned out.
Yeah.
Chronic stress is associated with more frequent and more severe viral infections, lower vaccine take rate. How important was that during COVID? Speeding of chromosomal aging, speeding of cancer growth of certain cancers, and slowing of wound healing. So, I mean, there's decades-long research showing all of these deleterious effects of chronic stress. If you're chronically stressed and you're pumping out adrenaline consistently, and I know this from my work when I was at the National Institutes of Health working on rats and the stress response in rats, your adrenal glands can double in size. And, and there's at a certain point, you just can't sustain it and you fail. Your body fails. So chronic stress is not good. Your life expectancy is lower. You're at risk for cardiovascular diseases and stroke and diabetes and so on. So, yeah, there have to be breaks in all of this. Timeouts. And what you described for the sports, elite athletes, they figured this out. In fact, there was an early study also with the military. I remember probably about 30 years ago, I was on a committee of the National Academies of Sciences called the Committee on Military Nutrition Research. And there was a study where they were finding that recruits who were going through boot camp, jungle environments, extreme cold, desert, for 4 weeks, 1 week at a time, that when they started with boot camp and then did the rest, there were a lot of them that were getting sick with pneumonia and colds and things. And all they did was reverse the order in which they had these experiences and put the boot camp in the middle. Not that boot camp is that terribly relaxing, but it's less stressful than these other extreme environments. And they got rid of the problem. So, it's really important to, for organizations and the C-suite to realize that pushing your people, it's like a racehorse. If you push your racehorse to keep on going and, they're going to fail. They're going to pass out. They're going to, drop dead. So C-suite people need to recognize that this is not a good thing, that it is a good thing to give breaks, to give mental breaks, to give opportunities for social interaction. That's another thing we didn't talk about. Relationships are really an important way of reducing stress, of nourishing and that's part of spirituality as well, going back to spirituality. Feeling connected to your colleagues, feeling connected to your organization, and feeling connected to the community around is really an aspect of spiritual experience.
Yeah, and I know, and that's a great segue. I was just thinking about this sense of belonging and community part spirituality, and you kind of segued beautifully into it for me.
Well,
and I was minded of conversation I had with somebody from LinkedIn recently, and LinkedIn spends an enormous amount of time curating their workspaces to build a sense of community and belonging within different work environments, they recognize that the people that do coding work and operate in a very different way to perhaps people that might work in customer service or B2B sales, who might work very differently to some people that work within marketing that might be more collaborative. And, so they spend an awful lot of time and energy thinking about how they create these micro communities within the organization that create a sense of belonging and community within the places that they work, but are structured and organized in a way that also integrate performance into it, that the coders, I guess, are next to the people they need to be next to so that those side meetings can happen easily, that there's a flow to how people interact in a space. So this stuff can be done really thoughtfully. This isn't by accident. You just don't happen to get a bunch of coders sat around the same desk. You need to curate these spaces so that people feel like they belong, and that's when you're going to get the best work out of them.
Yes, absolutely. And so one of the things that we did with the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine, when we had the opportunity to build 3 buildings for the center, the mind building, the body building, which is also called the Cantor building because of a generous donation, and the spirit building, so mind, body, spirit. We on purpose created spaces where people can gather in different size groups. So it's amazing to watch. There's the entrance, the lobby for the mind building, which is where all the administrative work goes on, the creation of online courses, the educational work, and so on. There's a 3-story atrium, and if I'm walking past from on the 3rd floor, I can look down, and there are 4 very comfortable, ergonomic, comfortable chairs. And there's always people sitting there, either working by themselves or in small groups having little conferences, or just sitting and relaxing and chatting. So that's a comfortable space where small groups can gather. We have a beautiful staff lounge that has a full kitchen where larger groups can gather, and then they can cook food together. And you need to also program spaces. So you can't, if you don't build the spaces, you can't do these activities, but you can't just leave it alone and build them. You need to sort of program them as well. But there's also quiet spaces where people can be quiet and alone. So people really have to have choices, as you said, and it has to be engineered. In the book, I also described the headquarters of Green Mountain Power in Colchester, Vermont, where the CEO on purpose moved out of what she called the Crystal Palace, where the CEO was isolated and behind 2 desks, 2 layers of secretaries, and came in a separate entrance and so on. She moved everybody to what used to be a warehouse, and placed the C-suite folks next to the linemen, the guys who go out in a snowstorm and fix the grid, because that Green Mountain Power operates the grid, the electric grid for the entire state of Vermont. So just by doing that, it made the point through spatial arrangement that those people are the people who are making this thing work. They are as important as the C-suite folks, just by the co-location of them.
Yeah, no, I get that completely. And you can, there are roles within businesses where perhaps there are sensitive conversations to be had and things like that, HR or accounting and so on, where people need those spaces that are private more often than not.
Yes.
But there are equally, we can curate spaces for performance that are a lot more flat from an organizational structure perspective, and you often hear about the buzz that's created in a more of an open plan space when the bosses are on the floor working with people, that there's a a level playing field element to a business when that's happening. That's energetic. Yeah, it's really interesting. Do you think there's something in your perspective, and perhaps, obviously you and I have a friend in Stephanie Taylor as well, that this view of a physician and a medical person of looking at the body from the inside out and understanding how humans interact with spaces from a health perspective, from a human body perspective, that we've been missing often in the built environment, that we see these as engineering problems to solve, but ultimately we build buildings for people. And is there a perspective that's unique, do you think, to people from the medical community, where they just see things through a different frame in that sense?
Yes, there's no question. I mean, there's no question that I think about buildings from a people-centric point of view. And it's obvious to me that the buildings are built for the people in them. There was an era of pre-COVID of starscitects who designed buildings as sort of the jewels in the crown.
There's still a few of those around. I hate to tell you.
Well, sculptural, and I can't help but think about the people in them. And I think healthcare architects have been ahead of the curve in this because, by definition, they're designing spaces for people who are sick and the people who take care of them. That said, when I was coming up through the ranks, hospitals were smelly, dark, mazes, all of these things, trigger the stress response. And it really has to do, I talk about this more in my previous book, In Healing Spaces. It has to do with the way that medicine evolved and that hospitals evolved in tandem. As more and more focus came on the diagnostic side, wings were added for radiology and, microbiology and, imaging and so on. And so hospitals became just accretions of different pieces that were not really thoughtfully put together. And then we took for granted that it was noisy. Sometimes in intensive care units or emergency rooms, the noise level can be up to 80 or 90 decibels. The level of firing of a motorcycle at near range, and that's harmful to the ears. We took for granted that a patient in the ICU would have all these dinging bells, and you're going in there at all hours of the day or night, and sticking them with drawing blood and all that. So it was something that we just took for granted. But their studies in Sweden were done quite a while ago, actually, showing that when they replaced the ceiling tiles in intensive care units, to be more sound absorbing, that the nurses slept better. They were in better moods. They were less stressed, and they weren't aware that the ceiling tiles were changed. So there are simple fixes, to the design of buildings, to mitigate all of these physiological stressors, noise being one of the biggest ones.
Yeah, absolutely.
The biggest single complaint of open office design is noise. Well, if you're sitting there in a recording studio. If you're designing a recording studio, you know how to direct sound, to reduce sound. Every single material that's used in building has an acoustic rating. If you start from the beginning designing a building with acoustics in mind, which is done for concert halls, you don't design a concert hall without an acoustical engineer. Recording studios, you got to have at the beginning an acoustical engineer. It's not an add-on. So office spaces have to be designed in that same way, thinking about the comfort of the person in it, And it's not only the comfort. If it's noisy and you're distracted and, your hearing is impaired, you're not going to be performing at peak. Now, one of the interesting things we found in our U.S. General Services Administration study, this was Kartik Srinivasan was the first author on this. We used big data to merge all these massive data sets from continuous recordings of light, sound, volatile organic compounds, temperature, humidity, and so on, with continuous recordings of heart rate variability, stress and relaxation response, and movement and sleep quality, and so on. So we found that, in fact, when it's too quiet, your stress response is higher. Now, that's sort of counterintuitive, except that the brain is a difference detector. And if it's too quiet, you can hear a pin drop, and that'll startle you. That'll trigger your stress response. So we found that there is a sweet spot for decibel levels in the office, which was about 45 or 50 decibels. If it was less, your stress response was less. If it was if it was less than 45 decibels, your stress response was higher. If it was more, and certainly back down to the 80, 90 decibels, your stress response was extreme. So you need to be thoughtful about how you design buildings for people in them.
While I have you, I just want to briefly talk to you about Ultra Protect, a partner of this podcast. Look, they're not here by accident. Like the podcast, they are passionate about driving changes in our indoor environment and are an all-round great company to deal with. They have years of experience in the industry and a team of people I have leaned on many an occasion for advice and insight. From continuously tracking air quality to specific sampling, they analyse and provide actionable insights for the built environment. Specialising in dust management, they provide amazing products and services that minimise risk and improve environments from construction sites to offices to manufacturing settings, through to solutions around ventilation aimed at improving the environment in the long term. It's a company well worth checking out. There are links in the show notes and on Air Quality Matters sites, and of course at Ultra Protect UK. Now, back to the podcast. A lot of the pollutants that we talk about and air quality issues that we talk about, this isn't something you don't build a tolerance to formaldehyde, right? There's no safe level of particulate matter. It's not that there aren't, it's not like adaptive comfort where there's some argument to say we want to put the body in a position of stress. There's less obesity and it's healthier, actually, if it has to work a little bit harder to maintain its temperature. We don't talk that way about air quality much. It's mostly about thresholds and harm and, trying to get to there's no such thing as zero risk, but constantly trying to reduce risk. The interesting thing with acoustics that I find fascinating is the cultural element to it. I had a really interesting guy on the podcast, an acoustician, about this time last year, which around Christmas and New Year, a guy called Jack Harvey Clark. It's worth people going and listening to this guy, actually. There's so much embedded in culture and agency when it comes to acoustics. So, for example, that in US offices, it's very normal for there to have to be sound systems put in place to create white noise so that there's a certain level of background noise curated in spaces for people to feel comfortable. Those systems get switched off in Asia. People can't tolerate the same level of noise. In Japan, for example, they're almost always redundant. They're turned off within weeks of being installed. There's a cultural phenomenon in America where people expect noise to be associated with power. So when your HVAC system goes on to boost or your air conditioning is on in the hotel, if you turn it up, you expect to hear a change in noise and you're uncomfortable if you don't. In other parts of the world, it's expected that engineering means you can have any level of flow of whatever you want without hearing any differences in audible tone. So the same manufacturers that work on a global level have to engineer the acoustics of their products differently, depending on where in the world those products are sold. And we know that from cars, that the sounds that are curated for the European audience in a vehicle is very different to the sounds that are curated in the States versus Asia. So there's a really interesting, really fascinating cultural element to that I never knew about. And the other one was agency, that like this, that the lack of noise. You can have lower noise in the space, but if you don't feel like you have control over that, that can create a stressor. Like you may hear noise outside the window, but if you don't feel like you can close the window and close away from that stressor, that will create more anxiety than stress than the noise itself. So there's these weird things going on with the environment that we have to provide these spaces for people where they've got some control over it, where they can put themselves in positions where they feel comfortable. And we've seen that with the well-building standards and things like this understanding of light temperature and the horizontal aspects of lights later on in the evening versus the vertical nature of lights during the day. We know that work was done very early on in the medical fields, in ICU departments, trying to find that balance between restorative nighttime lighting and providing enough light for nurses to do their work. You know, that they've been trying to find those very fine line balances between keeping somebody alert and being able to work and operate effectively through a night, but not create an environment that's harmful to them in the long term.
Right. And you're talking about two different things here that are both really important. That's agency and control.
Yeah.
And light. I do want to get to the point of light. Control is really important. So, and that's the relationship between control and the stress response is very important. So, I tell a story in actually, I think in both healing spaces and in, well at work of, I was, in an airplane flying from DC to Detroit. And, I was sitting in the middle seat, and I used to get very airsick. So I was looking for the air sickness bag. I like to be prepared. And I was getting anxious because I couldn't find the air sickness bag. And the gentleman to my left said, "Don't worry, I'm a pilot," and handed me his air sickness bag. So I was very grateful. As we're climbing to 35,000 feet, and I said, "It's always good to be sitting next to a pilot." And he said, "But when we got to 35,000 feet, he said, but I couldn't do anything if anything happened to this plane. It's a 737, because I fly F-16s off of aircraft carriers." And I said, "Well, now you tell me." You should have told me before. And I said, "Okay, do you feel when you're landing your little jet on in the middle of a storm, in the middle of the night, on an aircraft carrier, little boat down below in the Sea of Japan, do you feel stressed?" And he said, "Well, we feel all those things. We feel our heart beating fast. We feel sweaty. We feel like running to the bathroom. But we've been trained to make our stress response work for us." They take these as signals that, okay, we need to do something. Our body, our brain is detecting that we're off course. We need to change course. And that reduces your stress response. Okay. Why is that? Because there is a relationship between whether you are in control versus whether you are not in control and your stress response. So if you are in a high stress, low control situation, you will feel stressed. If you're in a high stress, high control situation where you can do something about it, that's when you feel exhilarated. Presumably that's why people become pilots and jet fighters and whatever. And that's why people like going to theme parks where they can be on a roller coaster.
Or adrenaline sports.
Yes, adrenaline. You get that adrenaline rush that is exciting. It's energizing, but you're in control. And so we need to be in control of our environments in order to be not stressed. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, that's very true. And that applies all the way down the scale. You know, that you know, for people in what seemingly are very benign environments, still not having agency over that environment is a long-term stressor.
Right.
And then I was talking about lighting and your eyes lit up as well.
Lighting, yes.
Yeah, because that's fascinating as well.
Light is really, really important. So we know from many, many, many studies that full spectrum sunlight between 8 and noon, 30 minutes of exposure to full spectrum sunlight in the morning will help you sleep at night. It's counterintuitive. What you do in the morning helps you sleep at night, but that's how it works. On the other hand, if you're exposed to, so that's blue light, full spectrum sunlight is mainly blue. And during the day, just think about the sun as the sun moves and it becomes afternoon and then it begins to set, it's redder. The light is redder. So it's called circadian rhythm, circadian light. All of us, all of our cells, all animals, all plants have a circadian rhythm that fits with the sun. And so if you are exposed to blue light for some period in the evening, it can be sort of 30, 40 minutes, which can be the blue light coming off your computer or your smartphone. It will be as energizing as a cup of coffee. Now, if you're supposed to be going to sleep, you don't want to be exposed to blue light because that'll be energizing and then you will not fall asleep. You'll fall asleep, take longer to fall asleep. You won't have a good quality sleep and you'll be fatigued the next day. So you need to have that rhythm of blue light in the morning, redder light in the evening, and have that sort of pace to set your circadian clock and to perform at peak. If we take this back into the workplace, if you want to be performing at peak the next day and not fatigued, you need to pay attention to the light exposure. Now, if you're in an office space where it's got a large footprint, the sunlight that comes in through the windows will not penetrate to the people in the middle of the office. So you don't get the benefit of that circadian light. So you have to have a way of getting exposed to the circadian light in the morning, which can be access to the outdoors, sitting near a window, or having full spectrum sunlight boxes, which have been shown to, it's over 30 years known to be as effective or almost as effective as antidepressants in a form of depression called seasonal affective disorder. So full spectrum sunlight, full spectrum light boxes have been around for decades and decades, and actually have been shown to improve any sort of depression. So it also helps with jet lag. If you're flying from one time zone to another, exposure to full spectrum sunlight first thing in the morning will help you quickly acclimatize to the new time zone.
You said something there, and I don't know why I came back to it, but it was to do with the health of buildings and this world that you've written about so frequently, about creating spaces for people to flourish in, this well-being space. And you kind of dismissed something at the beginning, which I wanted to go back to because I thought it was fascinating. And it was it's where you said it's a given that buildings shouldn't cause any harm, right? It's just this assumption that we have.
Oh, I'm not dismissing it. I'm just saying it's really important, but it's a starting point.
Yeah, so it's the given. No, I don't mean it's that. What I was interested in asking you was, it seems like a no-brainer that it is a given that we should have good air quality in spaces. That's just like obvious, right? Yet, time and time again, that's not what's happening. That it's not valued in the right way. So whatever about the hard road ahead when it comes to some of but you could argue the softer stuff, right, of well-being, but the hard stuff of the do no harm bit, we kind of in a way dismiss as going, well, yeah, that's obvious. It's just a given that a space, the place you work in, you shouldn't leave at the end of the day in a worse position than you entered from a health perspective. Yet all over the country, that's what people are doing, aren't they? Entering workplaces, and whether it's exposure to radon or poor air quality or infection risk or whatever it is, are being put in positions where these spaces are causing them harm. That must just seem like an anathema to you that happens.
When I made that comment, I started by saying every 30 years or so, the public and building science experts and medical experts become more aware of this. what makes you more aware of how buildings can make you sick is when a whole lot of people get sick in a building, right? From different things. So if we start with going back into, I believe it was the 1930s, when Richard Lord Riley discovered or claimed that tuberculosis could be spread through the ventilation system. And the way he did this is he put rats in one room and a tuberculous patient in another, and the rats got sick through the ventilation. But then, the medical community kind of forgot about that. And then in the 1970s, there was Legionnaire's disease, sick building syndrome. And why that's called Legionnaire's disease is there was a conference of Legionnaires. They were sort of a group of people belonging to this society who all got sick in a particular hotel, and it was traced to the ventilation system. And it was a bacteria called Legionella, which was named subsequently Legionella, that was spread through the ventilation system. And then I think also in the 70s, when there was a lot of attention to sort of enclosing buildings and keeping buildings closed, and yet ventilation systems had fiberglass linings that absorbed moisture, and then mold got stuck in it, and mold spread. So you get the spread of mold. So every few decades, the public and the medical community and building community recognize that disease can be spread through ventilation systems. And we're getting more and more sophisticated about that, and recognizing that it's not only good enough to have clean, fresh air turnover and excellent filtration, but you got to also change the filters. So if you don't change the filters when there's, in the West, all the fires and, the smoke and those particulates get stuck in the filters, but you need to change the filters in order to have clean air. So it's really, really important. So I don't want to dismiss it, but I'm saying that is the foundation. Do no harm, do not spread disease, have clean air, have excellent filtration and ventilation, access to fresh outdoor air, but then add on top of it the well-being piece.
Yeah, and it was interesting. I was chatting to Bronwyn and Georgia last week about the UN event, about this idea of putting the human right element of it front and center. And the interesting thing about that is the framing that this creates, that when something becomes a right, it introduces the fairness element to it, that it starts empowering people to say, this is not right, this is not fair, that I should be able to go to insert building you go to, school, classroom, office, healthcare facility, whatever, and it shouldn't be presenting risk to me. Like that's not what this building was designed to do. Like, I have a right to be in a space and not be made sicker or be exposed to pollutants or whatever it is that the risk is. And I think that's a really interesting framing, that it kind of goes back to that it's a given. Like, this shouldn't be up for discussion. I think what's interesting is that the built environment is very complex, and as Joseph Allen says, it has a very long tail. It's an environment unlike any other industry. Doesn't have 5 or 6 organizations owning 80% of it. It's owned by and managed by hundreds of thousands of different organizations, all the way down to mum and pup businesses that own and rent small office spaces above shops in a high street. It's an incredibly complex ownership structure. So it's a really difficult beast to crack, or egg to crack, because you're not just trying to convince 5 or 6 organizations that this is the right thing to do, that we've got to somehow build the case, as ironic as it seems, the business case or whatever the case is, that we should be maintaining ventilation systems and lighting systems and creating good environments for people. And that's a very hard argument to win when a small organization is fighting to stay alive, in the hard world that is out there in workplaces.
The argument is bolstered by the public knowing this. And as I said, pre-COVID, people were not aware of this at all. And certainly post-COVID, everybody in the world who had access to the internet could see the images of, the virus spewing out of the ventilation system. So when the public demands that a building be healthy and say that I am not going to work in this building, and in fact, but it's not good enough to just be healthy. It's also to be a well-being space. So, there's the great resignation post-COVID of people saying, I'm not going to work for this organization. Why should I go to a smelly, musty, dark, 6-foot high wall cubicle farm, which is noisy, when I can work from home and be perfectly productive? And people were resigning and going to organizations that did pay attention to their how they felt, not only their health but their emotional well-being. And so there is that economic drive. Also, the argument for the C-suite and even mom and pop is that the biggest expenditure that you have is your employees. And if you have high turnover because people are quitting, or you have presenteeism or absenteeism, that's not good for your bottom line. And there are more and more studies coming out now about return on investment for designing for physical health and emotional well-being. And so Casey Lindbergh, who worked with me when we did the GSA studies and is now at HKS, led a study where they calculated return on investment and found that over $4 million benefit by designing buildings in such a way, and about 300,000 or more, close to $4,000 per employee is benefited the bottom line. So there are arguments both at the top to convince the owners that this is good for their business, and there's arguments from the people working there that's saying they're going to vote with their feet. They're going to leave if it's not a comfortable environment. Now, things are changing now because, it's harder to get work, and people just unfortunately don't have that kind of
agency,
agency, to say I'm just quit because But if organizations don't pay attention to the quality of life of their employees, they will suffer in the end.
Yeah, I agree, and I think we are at an interesting point where we're trying to build the evidence base. I was talking to a really interesting economist on this a few months back, where he was basically articulating how economists think about investment in the built environment and the kind of volume of numbers they need to make the decisions that they need to where money goes. And he says we're just not there when it comes to the ROI argument for health and well-being. We're still in the trust us, we're academics. We did a really interesting study and it clearly shows that phase of things. And we're on the right trajectory. I think, every month you see more and more work come out that tries to quantify performance and sickness and health and presenteeism and all of these benefits, academic results in education settings, and we're building it, but we've got a bit of a ways to go. And I think, unfortunately, from my viewpoint, the timing has been out. We've seen a die-off in interest post-COVID of healthy building environments, and we haven't built enough evidence quickly enough about the performance side of it. So we're seeing this trough a bit at the moment of interest in healthy buildings, and it's frustrating for a lot of people.
It is, but so as I said, when the work was done about tuberculosis, there was very little scientific evidence, and I think it was somewhat ignored. When the work was done about Legionnaire's disease and then sick building syndrome, and then there's a trough and there's less interest, and we go back to sort of complacency. But I think the good news is that each time there are these. Yeah, there's an improvement and there's more awareness, and there are still people who are continuing to do the work. as evidenced by the United Nations launch of the Healthy Indoor Air Commission. So I
and
think,
it's always an interesting perspective thing, isn't it? From inside the bubble, time seems to move quite slowly and quite frustratingly
yeah,
slow. But actually, when you look at it comparatively, how far we've come in half a decade in recognition, and also capabilities change very quickly as well. We're able
yes,
to monitor and see the air and the indoor environment more broadly in ways that we couldn't have even conceived 10 years ago. Like the technology is moving incredibly fast in that sense.
incredibly fast. Yeah, no, I agree. And technology is going to be the solution, I think. Also to creating individualized control environments for your sound preference, your temperature and humidity preference. And, that's one of the things I talk about in the book is that it costs a lot to stay within the ASHRAE standards of less than 30%, greater than 30% relative humidity and less than 60%, which we found that when you're outside those relative humidity ranges, your stress response is 25% higher. And interestingly, almost simultaneously, you mentioned Stephanie Taylor. She found that when it's less than 30% relative humidity, there was a much higher rate of viral infection in hospitals. Probably because when it's dry, your mucous membranes are drying out, and you're going to be more susceptible to viruses. So how do you deal with that? It costs a lot of money to humidify or dehumidify a whole building. But you can have local, like a desk humidifier, or temperature wise, temperature is so variable between individuals, and everybody has a different temperature level of comfort. Well, there are now office chairs online where they're either heating or cooling, just like your car seats. So there are local technological advances that can help you create your bubble of well-being and comfort wherever you are.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by the lack of progress of kind of personalized environmental controls. It's something that I've seen floating around for many years, and different academics have studied this in different environments, and there are some really strong use cases for it, like really, really strong use cases. But it's just seems to be one of those technologies that's really struggled to get traction out in the real world. Like we've seen elements of it in very critical environments. So people that do banking and working in front of lots of computers, doing making big risk judgments, and in following lots of really big information. Those desks create an awful lot of heat with the amount of processors and screens and things they have going. So that they've had personalized environmental controls on those desks for many years. Actually, that they've controlled those environments because they need their people operating at peak performance. They're 20% down on their performance. It has big bucks impact, like so in some environments they have, but arguably, particularly in more extreme climates, personalized environmental controls make an awful lot of energy sense, because you're really you're just conditioning really the spaces around the people rather than the entire office floor. Makes loads of sense, but for some reason just hasn't really taken off in the way that's engineering and technologically possible. It just doesn't seem to have landed. Be interesting. I think it might be interesting to see over the next 10 years how that progresses, that whole sector.
I think so. I think it'll improve. It'll continue.
I was fascinated to ask you about your journey to here, because it's been an unusual and winding one. I don't know how far back to take listeners to start the story, but it's been a really interesting process from where you were looking at immune response and brain immune responses, and working really in that field and pushing the boundaries there, I hasten to add, from our conversations to where you are now. Is there a contrarian in you to some degree that likes to look at the
Yes,
edge cases of science and
really
environments,
good.
and
Yes, yes. I
ask
am.
the tough questions? Because you haven't put yourself in comfortable places. Let's put it that
You're
way.
right. I must be a contrarian. No, it all started with a single patient. Okay. And I feel like I've come full circle to the whole person. So when I was actually in family practice for a couple of years. And then I went back and trained as a rheumatologist, an arthritis doc. And one Christmas Eve in 1979, I was called to see a patient who had, it was an emergency consult, and he had developed a scarring autoimmune inflammatory disease. He looked like he'd been in third-degree burns all over his body. His arms were flexed, and he was in huge pain. He had to have the sheets tented up over his legs, couldn't bear to have the sheets touch him. And he had been in hospital for a fatal form of epilepsy where every time he tried to even eat, and he'd have a fit. And so he was receiving an experimental drug for epilepsy that changed brain serotonin. This was before the SSRIs. And he had this, it helped his epilepsy, but he developed this horrible scarring disease. And the question to me as a rheumatologist was, is this related to the drug we're giving him? And I didn't know the answer. But, and this tells you how long ago this was, it was in the days when you certainly didn't have a smartphone to ask the question. I wanted to know if there's any relationship between serotonin, this neurotransmitter, and scleroderma, which was the illness he looked like he had. And I ran, it was Christmas Eve, across the hospital to the other end of the hospital to the library and convinced the librarian to keep the library open after 4 p.m. so that we could get on the teletype machine and connect to the mainframe in Ottawa. This was in Montreal. And ask the question, is there any connection between serotonin and scleroderma? We're sitting there looking at the teletype machine, and all of a sudden it starts typing. And there was a woman in Poland who published a couple of papers that there is an abnormality of serotonin metabolism in scleroderma. So that single patient convinced me that you can do something to the brain and trigger an autoimmune inflammatory disease. Now, I turned out to be wrong. But it led me down a path. I mean, it turned out to be wrong of the cause of this, but, and that's a whole nother story. It turned out that the material they were using was impure, and it ended up 10 years later in the L-tryptophan eosinophilia myalgia epidemic, where people got the same illness from impure L-tryptophan. But that's another story. But seeing this patient convinced me that you could do something to the brain and cause an autoimmune disease. And I spent the next 15, 20 years of my life studying the brain-immune connection. And I started off by sprinkling serotonin, the neurotransmitter, on immune cells, kind of immune cells called macrophages. And I saw that the serotonin actually changed how these immune cells did their job. They gobbled up more stuff. And then I realized that if I'm going to understand the connection between the brain and the immune system, I need to do it in an intact organism. You can't just do it in cells. So when I went to the National Institutes of Health, where I was for 26 years before coming to the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine 13 years ago, I started working with rats, and I discovered that the brain's stress center is important in susceptibility to inflammation and autoimmune inflammatory diseases like arthritis in rats. And when you can prove that in rats, the scientific and medical community believes it. You know, before that, back in the 70s, even the 80s, one of my supervisors told me, "You'll do this work when grass grows here on the palm of his hand." And this is new age. This is shishi-fu-fu. This is not real. The brain does not talk to the immune system. The immune system does not talk to the brain. Well, now we know there's a huge amount of information, not only that stress can make you sick, but how it can make you sick, how the brain sends molecules to the immune system through nerve endings, through the bloodstream, how the immune system sends molecules to the brain through the bloodstream, through nerve endings, and so on. But back then, there was just a small group of us who were doing research in this area. And what gave me the confidence to do it is because I had seen this single patient and I really believed that there was a connection. So then how did I get to the built environment? I'm assuming that's what you want to know.
Yeah, kind of. Is that what led you to that sentiment that you talk about in the book, where you say science is not a lonely endeavor, it's about fellowship? Was it that those formative years where you were working with a small group of people trying to do the science?
Yes. Yeah, it's not only the formative years, it's all along. At each point, what gave me the courage, if you will, or the strength to go against the prevailing dogma, was the small group of people who were like-minded and were doing similar work. And we came together. One important thing that brought us together was the MacArthur Foundation. I was on a MacArthur network, mind-body network, where we were tasked with figuring out how hypnosis cures warts. Now, only the MacArthur Foundation could fund a network doing that. And we eventually did, and it was about 15 of us from around the country, around the world, who came together 3 times a year and were supported with actually not a whole lot of money, joint postdocs and a small amount of collaborative funding, to bring neuroscientists together with immunologists, brain imagers together with hypnosis experts, and so on. And that was really important in sustaining us, because each one of us, each 15 of us, would go back to our own institutions and we'd be kind of marginalized, or, I was denied promotion at the National Institutes of Health to the equivalent of full professor because it stated that the work she's doing in the brain immune connection has no relevance to human health. Fortunately, I eventually got my promotion, and I proved them wrong. But maybe that's the contrarian in me. But you do have to have that support network around of people who, both from above and your colleagues who are working on the same issues from a different angle, to gather enough data, enough rigorous scientific data to prove what otherwise seems like a flaky notion. And I address this in my first book, In the Balance Within, The Science Connecting Health and Emotions, of where did Western medicine go wrong in not accepting, not believing these notions that have been around for millennia, that stress can make you sick, that believing can make you well. And the reason is that we didn't have the scientific tools to measure something as ephemeral and abstract as an emotion until we had brain imaging and, molecular biology and, genetics and so on. And now we can measure all these things and prove that there are these connections. And we can do the same thing for the built environment, which we couldn't do before. We couldn't measure continuously and in real time up to 11 different environmental attributes and connect them to the massive data amounts coming from your heartbeats and your heart rate variability and your movement and so on. We can do that now.
It must have been really interesting for you to be on both sides of this, to be at the forefront of pushing an idea in science and in medicine that is fighting against dogma and hierarchies, and no doubt patriarchy as well in some instances. And I imagine it was a fairly tough fight at times, but coming through that and coming through and establishing a new way of thinking about health and being able to prove that to quackery, where for every person that comes through this with a new way of thinking about medicine and so on, there are also people that are pushing boundaries that are potentially dead ends, or going down a route that isn't going to be resolvable. And it's a constant. Science is fascinating in that way, that there's this assumption that science and medicine is settled somehow, and that we're, that the dogma is there for a reason, because we know what we're talking about at this stage. And but it isn't. That's just fundamentally not the way it works. It's a constant process of trial and error, and people pushing and testing the limits, and being right and being wrong in equal measure, and about creating systems within science and medicine that enable that, don't disable that process, is a really hard one to find balance in. And
it is, but I always relied on the rigorous. If you're working on the edge where the conventional community doesn't believe you or rejects you, you need to be more rigorous than the rest of them. You need to be more careful about every study that you design. You cannot be sloppy, and you also need to do stuff that is conventional. So during the anthrax attacks in Washington, D.C., I quickly turned my lab to looking at the impact of anthrax lethal toxin on immune cells, and that's, nobody can claim that that's fringe. So I kind of always had two parallel things going on in order to stay credible. Credibility is really important.
That's really clever, actually. And we will come on to the buildings bit, but I think that's really smart. And I think that's what somebody that knows how to play politics and the game does. And that has feet in both camps, because you see that in science, people find themselves on the fringes and only on the fringes. And it makes it very hard to establish credibility, because you're then just dismissed as the quack, right? And that is a very hard place to be, even if you're right. And unfortunately, we've seen time and time again, there are people that have been proven right many years after they've passed, or that their career is finished. And it's only been because they haven't been able to, for want of a better word, play the game, or create credibility around their work. And that's a real loss to science. We've lost so many years to people. The Wellses, we're talking of TB science. Frederick and Mildred Wells were doing phenomenal work on TB and UV and the infection risk in the air, but were largely dismissed for decades because they were just really awkward people, and they existed on the fringes and just couldn't operate in the common world.
I think I learned that from my father, who was a professor. My parents were from Romania. My father was an endocrinologist. And during World War II, he was deported in 1943 to what was a work camp or concentration camp in Russia, in a place called Transnistria. And we did not know about that until after he died. And, he eventually made his way to Montreal. And I think that I could see, even when I was a teenager and I worked in his lab when I was 15, I at some level was aware of the politics of science, and so his lab was two floors above Hans Sellier's lab. Hans Sellier coined the word stress. And Sellier was marginalized, was rejected by the scientific community because he had the audacity to speak to the lay public. You didn't do that in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. But he, I think at some level, I recognize that if you're going to do this kind of work, and I think it might have been even subconscious, that you really have to be rigorous and have a foot in both camps. There's also the politics of science. So when I was at the National Institutes of Health, and I had a hard time getting colleagues to work with me on this brain-immune connection, I was told by the director of the Arthritis Institute, well, you're studying macrophages, and that's good. That's immune cells, but you're putting these neurotransmitters on them. That we don't do that. I went to the director of the National Institute on Neurological Diseases and Stroke, and he said, well, this is great. You're studying neurotransmitters, but you're looking at immune cells. We don't do anything below the neck. So, part of my mission when I was at NIH, and this had to do with my naivete, probably also because I was a woman, and I knew that I could not at that point in the 80s and 90s have a director position at the NIH. There were no women in any director position. So I had this bit of a freedom to do kind of things outside the box. But I decided that I am going to convince these guys that there is a connection. And so I created this network, bringing the Neuroscience and Immunology Institutes together, also because I needed them in order to do my work, to collaborate. And I, at one point, because of the MacArthur Foundation network, we held a conference at the National Institutes of Health called on neuroimmunomodulation. You couldn't call it the mind-body connection. You had to call it something, fancy like neuroimmunomodulation. And I had gotten funding from the MacArthur Foundation, the Fetzer Alliance, the Dana Alliance, and to do an exhibition at the National Library of Medicine on emotions and disease, exploring why it is that Western medicine has rejected these concepts. So it was a historical exhibition looking at the context of science through the ages, starting with the four humors. And the National Library of Medicine has amazing incunabulate texts and books. And so there was some beautiful material that we could display. And the then director of the National Library of Medicine, Don Lindbergh, was fully behind this. And Liz Fee was the director of the History of Medicine Division. And so we created this thoughtful exhibition, which ended up being listed in the Washington Post as best in Washington, amongst all the Smithsonian exhibitions. And we were very pleased with that. But at the same time, we held an international conference in the building across from the National Library of Medicine. And in order to get the buy-in from the scientific directors and the directors of all the institutes at NIH, I went around to them and asked them each for $5,000. Now, that's not much at all. But what it meant is that they had to have a representative sitting in the audience to check out whether what was being presented was fringe, flaky, or real. And by then, it was 1997, there was enough accumulated rigorous scientific evidence from around the world showing exactly how the brain and the immune system communicate with each other, and showing that if those communications are intact, you have health, and if they're broken, you have disease. So by the time that we held a follow-on conference, again with the MacArthur Foundation, in 2001 at the National Institutes of Health, every one of the institute directors who had balked in 1997 at being part of this thing wanted to be on the podium to introduce, now we called it the mind-body connection. So that was okay in that short period of time. And finally, the acting director of NIH, Ruth Kirstein, said to all of these directors, no, I'm going to introduce this conference. So, you can make a difference if you're strategic and if you have the courage to ultimately be rejected. But I always felt, and this is where being a woman was a good thing, I always felt that since I didn't or couldn't be a director of anything, what's the worst thing that can happen? I can lose my job. I can stay home and take care of my daughter, which would be wonderful. Or I could go into practice again the way it had been. I had lots of choices. So I didn't have to stay on the straight and narrow in order to climb the hierarchy. I could just do what I felt I was committed to doing, is proving this connection that I so believed in because of that single patient.
So we never got there in the conversation, but now's a good juncture. Where did the environment come into your thought process? Because we talk about this all the time on the show, is tell me why your environment isn't a good story for the symptoms I'm seeing before me. It's that kind of idea that particularly with the immune response, and particularly, we see this at the moment, another frontier of science at the moment is CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndromes, where there's a lot of, pushback from establishment. There's a lot of people trying to do the right thing. It seems very analogous to a lot of what you were saying here. And I don't know whether they're right or wrong, frankly. I think anybody that deals with the brain immune response, it seems from my perspective to be natural that the environment would then become part of the story. Was that the same for you, or was that a journey to get there? Did something else happen where you went, oh my God, I think we should be looking at X?
It was a journey, and it was sort of a natural evolution. And so two things happened. So here I was a rheumatologist. I discovered that the brain stress center is important in susceptibility to arthritis. And about 8 or 9 years later, I went through a period of extreme stress. My mother was dying of breast cancer. I was under a lot of stress at work. I testified before Congress on a controversial issue that my institute director was on the other side of. I went through a lot of stress. I moved into a new house just after my mother died, and I had developed inflammatory arthritis. So I go through a period of stress, I get inflammatory arthritis. How ironic is that? I plugged myself into an early arthritis protocol at NIH. I had knee biopsies. I was supposed to go back into hospital for more knee biopsies and liver biopsies and an experimental drug for rheumatoid arthritis. And instead, my mother died. I came back to Washington. I had just moved into a new house, and I was sitting on the deck writing what was to become my first book, The Balance Within, The Science Connecting Health and Emotions. And my neighbors, who were Greek, rang the doorbell and brought me Greek food, tzatziki, dolmades, moussaka. And they said, "Are you a writer?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. Why do you ask?" And they said, "Because we've always wanted a writer to stay at our cottage in Crete." And I said, "I'm a writer." And I went I went with them to Crete for only a couple of weeks, really, instead of going back into hospital. And I had an aha moment in Crete. So what happened is, the first day I plugged my computer in and I had the wrong voltage or something, and the computer blew. So I couldn't write. And I immersed myself in the in the rhythms of the village. It was a tiny village on the south coast of Crete. And I'd be swimming in the ocean every day, and surrounded by all the grandmothers of the village who were feeding me healthy Mediterranean diet. And I started to climb the hill above the village, on which there was ruins of a temple to Asclepius, the Greek god of healing. And I'd sit there in the shadow of a tiny Greek chapel with the icons and the candles, and look out over the blue Mediterranean and the white stucco buildings and the fuchsia bougainvillea. And I'd listen to the goats and the sheep and the wind. And hours would go by and I didn't know I was meditating. And I was surrounded by my neighbors and by the villagers who were I didn't realize I was practicing the 7 domains of integrative health, basically there. I was sleeping soundly under the stars. I came back and I saw my doctor, and he said, "What did you do? You don't have to go into hospital. You're so much better." And I didn't realize that I was practicing the 7 domains of integrative health. So I started to ask myself, what was it about that environment that helped me heal? Was it what I saw? Was it what I heard? Was it what I smelled? Was it what I ate? Was it what I did in the space? It was all of the above, of course. And that became the foundation of my second book, Healing Spaces, The Science of Place and Wellbeing, which really merges sensory neuroscience with healing, with how does everything that you see, hear, smell, touch, do feed into your brain, trigger either the stress response or the relaxation response, the dopamine reward pathways, and how all of that, the anti-pain opioid pathways, how all of that feeds into helping the immune system do its job to heal. So that was one thing. The other thing was a single question by my colleague and ultimately 25-year collaborator from the U.S. General Services Administration, Kevin Kampshire, who at the time in 2000 was the research director for the GSA. The U.S. General Services Administration is the agency of the federal government that owns, operates, and builds all non-military federal buildings around the country and around the world, your embassies, your courthouses, your office buildings, and so on. And Kevin Kampshire asked me to help him measure the impacts of the built office spaces that he was designing and operating on the health and well-being of the people in those office spaces, over 374 million square feet of office space for over 2 million federal workers. And so we began in the year 2000 to use what were then, in retrospect, dinosaur devices, health tracking devices of, the heart rate variability, which is the gold standard for the stress and relaxation response. They were, the size of a large coffee mug glued to your chest with wires and stuff. And we did our first study, was published in 2010 in an office building that was being retrofitted. And we found that, to my surprise, and this was really, I don't know why I was surprised, that the people in the old office space that was had high mechanical noise, was musty, dark, 6-foot-high wall cubicles, the people in those spaces had significantly higher physiological stress responses, both on heart rate variability and salivary cortisol, than the same people and then other people in the new open office, airy, full of circadian light spaces with low mechanical noise, good ventilation. The people in the legacy spaces were significantly more stressed. They were not subjectively aware that they were more stressed in those spaces, but physiologically, the amount of stress they were experiencing was of a medical relevant level. And it carried on when they went home at night, because they were wearing these devices for 2.5 days. So we could tell that even when they were sleeping, their stress response was higher. So with that piece of evidence, we went on to do our subsequent studies after I moved to the University of Arizona, called Well Built for Wellbeing, where we used the state-of-the-art wearable devices for tracking health, movement, sleep quality, stress and relaxation response, and linked them to up to 11 different environmental attributes measured continuously and in real time, and using big data to analyze all of it, and basically came up with a prescription for a healthy well-being building. And by then, Kevin Kampshire was director of high performance federal green buildings for the GSA and chief White House sustainability officer for the GSA, and was in a position to implement these changes. And then COVID happened. So it was very, very relevant to have this granular data to say, this is the decibel level that is optimal, 45 to 50 decibels for reducing stress and enhancing well-being. This is the humidity level of greater than 30% and less than 60%, and actually more at about 45%, that is optimal for reducing stress. So we had all of that data, and in parallel studies, Kevin and Mariana Figuero and others were doing studies on light levels that were optimal. But it really came, the brain immune thing came from a single patient. The physical environment piece came from a single question from Kevin Campshire, and from my own personal experience in Crete of seeing what helped me heal.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. It makes me wonder how you see the next few years playing out. You know, it was a question I asked Georgina and Bronwyn, actually, was that, you know, in a world where we seem to be surrounded by standards now, kind of benchmarks for buildings, whether that's LEED or WELL or RESET or any number of them, right? Go AKS, we're looking at international proclamations of air quality being a human right and places should be, you know, healthy for everybody. Where does it go from here? Because it's not for lack of standards, is it? Or regulations or gold standard marks like WELL and LEED and others. We've got books like yours and from others that try and frame this for people in different ways. I thought what was really interesting about your book was, and you said to me before, this isn't a manual, this is a story. This is couched in examples that if you wanted to, you know, write this for engineers, it'd have just been another manual, right? Which you're bringing the story and the storytelling to this, which you do so well. Where does it go from here, do you think, from your perspective? Like in the next kind of 5 to 10 years, what's your hopes for this healthy building movement as a whole?
My hope is that it will more and more be implemented across many sectors. And you know, it's one building at a time, really. And my hope is, you know, I have now stepped down from my research director position at the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine to focus really fully on place and well-being and advising organizations that want to know how to do this. How did we take the 7 domains of integrative health and embed them into our Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine building complex, which, by the way, we did do with Casey Lindbergh pre-post occupancy surveys and found that the buildings perform in most domains as well, and if not better, than where the people were working before, which mostly was from home because the pre was during COVID. The place that the buildings perform best in is community, is connection to colleagues, connection to the organization, and connection to the surrounding community. And that is a real win because, you know, since COVID, there was an existential crisis amongst building owners, amongst organizations. What do we need common buildings for? You know, we don't need, why should people go lockstep 9 to 5 to a common building if they can be just as productive at home? The reason is for connection, for social connection, for that nourishment that you get from being together with colleagues. Yes, you get ideas, you can bounce ideas off of each other, but it's really that emotional nourishment. If you're sitting at home, back-to-back Zoom calls, back-to-back video calls all day, you're getting burnt out. You're lonely. You're depressed. You have no connection with your colleagues, really. And it's coming to a common workspace that helps you gain those connections. So taking all of what I've learned and with my colleagues over the last, 25 years and helping others to implement it into their own environments, whether it's work or school or, play or home. And in my book, I do have a section on how to embed these principles in your own home workspace. But that's what I'm hoping is that we have there'll be more research to be done. There's certainly a lot more research on return on investment. That really has to be done. That's not my area of expertise. But embedding these principles into actual buildings is something that I think we can do in the next 5 to 10 years. And the more organizations that do this, the more the employees, the more the public, the more people will want to be in these spaces. I wrote an op-ed article for the Arizona Daily Star when organizations were mandating people back to work. And I said, I live 10 to 20 minutes from 5 world-class spas. Nobody is mandating people to go to those spas. They want to go there because of the way they're designed and operated. Now, I'm not saying that an FBI building should be a spa, but there are elements of what we have discussed throughout this conversation that can be embedded to help people to work in spaces that support both emotional health and physical well-being. And that's what I see happening in the future. And that's what I want to do for the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And there's something very powerful about being able to talk about and take people to spaces that are thriving. Yes. It was one of the things actually the passive house community did very well here in Ireland for a long time when they were trying to advocate for passive house buildings, was they found one of the most powerful ways to do that was to bring politicians and decision makers and planners and the people involved with pushing standards to those spaces, to show them, to give them a sense of how it feels to be in a high performance home. And they arguably got more traction through that process than anything else. And I think every employee that finds themselves working in a high performing, thriving workplace that nourishes people and drives a sense of community and health and well-being becomes your best advocate for every next place that they go to, because they go, why not here? You create an army of advocates and champions for doing the right thing, that becomes infectious.
Yes. And I want to mention something that I should have mentioned earlier about, you mentioned Ireland. So one of the first studies that showed, when we go back to virtual reality and experiencing nature, and was Professor Sean McCann, who was head of bone marrow transplant, the bone marrow transplant unit in Dublin. And the bone marrow transplant unit was in an old, what used to be a Dickensian workhouse. And so in order to make the rooms positive pressure to keep infection out, because these patients have to be there for 6 to 8 weeks and no exposure to any potential infectious agent, they had to put the HVAC equipment right outside the windows. And all the patients could see out their window was HVAC equipment. So Professor McCann had this brilliant idea to install LCD projectors up on the ceiling that had to be specially created so that they could be easily cleaned, and to work with artists and with the city of Dublin to project on the wall of the patient's room images of nature. He would ask the patients, what would you like to see? So they would like to see cows grazing, horses grazing, going on a canoe ride on a small river. They want to see their loved ones. One patient he used to like to walk on Dunleary Pier with his dog and watch the ships go by. And so Professor McCann worked with the city of Dublin to install a webcam, and the patient was able to watch the ships go by from his room. This was published in 2010. So you can imagine the technology that has advanced, which now ultimately is what I described for the Studio Elsewhere and Morel Phillips' nature immersive experience. But back then, Sean McCann was able to show that patients who had exposure to this kind of experience had a better quality of life during their stay and then afterwards. and less depression. And so that was really the beginning of saying we can bring technologies into any space to help people with emotional well-being as well as physical health. And so, yes, I think the future is very, very positive because we have the technologies that keep advancing that can help bring all of these elements into those spaces.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. Esther, it's been brilliant chatting to you now. I've been so lucky to spend so much time talking to you over the last few weeks, including this podcast. So thanks so much for being so generous with your time. I think it's been a really fascinating conversation that I think looks at this from perspectives that we don't talk about enough in the built environment. So I thank you for that. And we will, of course, share links to the books and your publications in the show notes and all the usual places as part of the podcast. So thanks so much.
Well, thank you. It's been really a pleasure. It's just a wonderful conversation to have. I could go on for hours, but thank you so much. It's been wonderful.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks for listening. Before you go, can I ask a favour? Before you shoot off to whatever it is you have to do next, or even the next podcast, if you enjoyed what we've been talking about here, please do spread the word and let's keep building this community. And don't forget to check out our sponsors in the show notes. Ultra Protect, Eurovent, Erico, ACO, Farmwood and Zender, all amazing companies, and without them, this podcast would just simply not be possible. Check them out in the show notes at airqualitymatters.net, and do check out our YouTube channel. All this content is there, plus much more. See you again next week.